Hi all, and welcome to our third of 4 Regional ACE webinars this year. I'm Ryan Pratt, the VP of Marketing and Research at GradLeaders. For those of you who aren't aware, GradLeaders is a fairly new brand that's the result of a merger of 2 companies, MBA Focus and CSO Research, that have been in the industry for 30+ years. Today we partner with thousands of career centers and employers who use our technology to manage the entire campus recruiting and career development process. We're excited to be partnering with all 4 regional ACEs again this year for these webinars. Quick reminder before we kick this off, everyone has been automatically muted on entry, but if you have questions at any time throughout the webinar, feel free to type them into the chat window within WebEx, and please use the chat window, not the Q&A functionality. I know that's confusing, but it allows both Maddie and I to see the questions you're asking. So Maddie Foster is our presenter today. She has been serving students as a career counselor at UCSB for 2 years. In her role, she also focuses on serving undocumented students as a member of the Dream Scholar resource team to help her remain up to date on current immigration legislature and to collaborate with various campus departments to support those students. So that's what she's here to talk to you about today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Maddie.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. So as was stated, and you can clearly read in front of you, today I'm going to talk about working with undocumented students and the barriers that these students face, specifically in regards to their career development and future employment options. Before we get started though, I do want to ask you for a few moments of reflection. So everyone is different on their current knowledge or familiarity of working with undocumented students. So I want you to take a few minutes to think about the following questions. If you have a piece of paper in front of you, feel free to write down some of your thoughts. For career practitioners, how familiar are you with the undocumented student population on your campus? For instance, how would you reach out to this population if you wanted to provide specialized services for them? Also, how comfortable do you feel working with these students? Depending on your answer to that, what would help you feel more comfortable working with them? If you're an employer, think about how do you currently interact with undocumented students? And also, if you were an undocumented student, how would you feel about your organization and its perception? Well, I hope that this webinar helps to decrease any anxiety that you may have about working with undocumented students. Now, I do want to mention a few disclaimers. The first is that this talk will not focus on political views and what should or should not be done in regards to immigration law and policy. This is definitely a hot topic right now, but today's webinar will only focus on what the laws and policy currently are and how this affects undocumented students. The second disclaimer is that I'm not a lawyer. I have no legal background through education or work. I watched many episodes of Law & Order, but I'm not ready to make a career change into the legal world. I keep up on today's news in a similar fashion to most of you listening. I tend to hyper-focus around immigration news due to the student population that I work with, but I will be giving some resources along the way for you to provide you with up-to-date information. And to be completely honest, coming into my current role at UC Santa Barbara, I had no idea who undocumented students were, who Dream Scholars were, or that this population even existed. I grew up attending middle-class private schools with a lack of diversity, and even though I obtained an ethnic studies minor with my bachelor's degree, this population still escaped me. So when starting my current position and taking on the role of undocumented student liaison, I was very naive, very unaware, and very uneducated. At UC Santa Barbara, we actually have an undocumented student services coordinator. I met with her and had a conversation about who these students were and what challenges they faced. I filled in the career services spot on our Dream Scholar resource team, which consists of current undocumented students and representatives from multiple departments across campus. You may not have this support on your campus. I tell you this background because if you're in a similar mindset as I was, I applaud you for learning more about these students. We often forget that individuals do not start off as being experts in a topic, and I do not consider myself an expert. I am continually learning more and more about these students on a day-to-day basis, but I wanted to highlight a little bit of where I come from. Now, on to talking about working with undocumented students. First, we're going to talk about who these students are. So undocumented students are immigrants who entered the United States illegally or have stayed past their original visa date. They were typically brought in by the action of their parents at a very young age and have spent the majority of their lives living in the U.S. Some students don't even know that they are undocumented until they start to hit certain barriers, such as obtaining a driver's license or getting a job, depending on the state that you live in. If you're curious as to what your state laws are, I provided a link to the 2017 immigration report that highlights laws of various states regarding these topics. Now, the next few slides we'll be talking about DACA, the recent legislation updates, and options for students who cannot legally work in the United States. This information will seem very dry. However, it's very important to understanding the career options for undocumented students. So prepare to take lots of sips of coffee. Now, what is DACA? Well, DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it's an executive order presented by the Obama administration announcing that certain people who came to the United States as children may request consideration of deferred action for a period of 2 years subject to renewal. Deferred action typically means deferral of deportation, and this does not provide a lawful status. When an individual files for DACA, they also file an application for employment authorization. Once an individual receives this employment authorization, they're able to legally work in the United States in any position unless citizenship or permanent residence is required. Some guidelines to DACA are as follows. So students must be under the age of 31 as of June 15, 2012. They had to have come to the United States before the age of 16 and have continuously resided in the U.S. They either have to be currently in high school, have graduated from high school, obtained a GED, or are an honorably discharged veteran of the U.S. military. They also cannot have been convicted of a felony, significant misdemeanor, or 3 or more misdemeanors. The link at the bottom of the slide gives more information about DACA and its specific guidelines through the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services website. I also want to point out that DACA is separate from the DREAM Act, which you've probably been hearing also a lot about. The DREAM Act focuses on a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. It interacts with DACA because it focuses on the same population, but it also has separate legislation attached to it. Now, recently, there has been a lot of back and forth on whether or not DACA will continue and whether or not undocumented students should apply. On September 5th, 2017, DACA was rescinded. Individuals only had 1 month to file for one last renewal. However, on January 9th, 2018, a federal court order directed the Trump administration to partially resurrect the DACA program. Even more recently, as of February 13th, another judge in Brooklyn ruled in the same fashion as San Francisco. Because of these orders, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services has resumed accepting requests to renew an individual's DACA. They are not currently accepting new applications or applications for advanced parole, which allows an individual to leave and then re-enter the United States. This affects our undocumented students because in case of an emergency and they need to travel to their home country, they will not be allowed to re-enter the U.S. They also cannot participate in study abroad programs at this time. The University of California released a statement urging students to utilize this time to reapply for DACA unless directed by their UC immigration lawyer. So what could happen in the future? Well, as of a few days ago, the Supreme Court denied the review of the federal court orders. Basically, this means that there's no pressure to make a decision of DACA right now. and that DACA renewals will continue to be accepted. You may have heard about a March 5th deadline floating around for DACA. Because of this Supreme Court ruling, the deadline is basically obsolete and won't be revisited until summer session, especially with the hyper-focus right now on gun safety and gun control. For the future, there have been talks of continuing some form of DACA for the next few years. Right now, the goal of the administration is an orderly wind down of the program instead of an immediate termination, since that's the reason that these court orders came into play earlier this year. Now, this can be great news for students who have already received DACA and are able to renew, because again, most of these students will receive employment authorization to legally work in the United States. However, what if a student doesn't qualify for or has never received DACA in the past? Are there still ways for that individual to work? Yes. Mainly, it involves working for yourself and a little bit of maneuvering around the legal system. The first type of alternative way to work is independent contracting. So an independent contractor is a self-employed person who produces a specific type of work product in a determined amount of time. Oftentimes we think of these contractors in construction or remodeling, where an employer is able to control what the work product is, but not how that work will be done. Individuals are only required to give their employer their social security number or an individual taxpayer identification number in these settings. Federal law, though, does state that an employer cannot hire an independent contractor if they are aware that the worker is not authorized to work in the United States. However, an independent contractor is not required to discuss their immigration status with any potential client. So it's the responsibility of the employer to check that the independent contractor can legally work in the United States. I recommend for all students interested in becoming an independent contractor to research all the legal aspects of independent contracting and consult with an employment lawyer if necessary. Another way that students can work for themselves is in the form of starting a limited liability company or an LLC as a worker cooperative with others. A worker cooperative is a comprised of members who are both workers and owners. When other companies hire an LLC, they're hiring the entire cooperative and not an individual. So workers are not required to give personal information to the client company. In all cases, undocumented individuals still pay taxes through their social security number or an individual taxpayer identification number. If you'd like additional information about either of these options, I highly recommend reading Life After College, a guide for undocumented students, provided by the Educators for Fair Consideration. I've provided the link at the bottom of this slide. This document has provided most of this information today on alternative ways to work and goes into even more detail on governmental forms for students to file if they would like to pursue independent contracting or an LLC. When talking to students about independent contracting or forming an LLC, it's also important to remind them that these unauthorized employment options may have an impact on their ability to obtain legal immigration status in the future. It's a risk that they're taking, however, sometimes it's the only option for them to make a living. Now, I'd like to pause at this moment for any questions regarding this legal information that has been provided so far. I know it's a lot of information to take in, so if you have any questions about it, I would love to answer those now.
Thanks, Maddie. We have a few questions coming in already. The first one is going to be easy. Will the slides, or at least the electronic links you talked about, be provided after the call?
Yes, I believe so.
Yes, we are also recording this, so we will share the recording with everybody who registered and attended as well.
There we go.
The next question is, what do you recommend if a student does not have a Social Security or tax ID number?
So any individual can apply for an individual taxpayer identification number. So I would recommend, if they haven't been given, typically students are given a Social Security number with their DACA. And so if they do not have DACA, they can request an individual taxpayer identification number.
Perfect, thanks. Somebody else just wants you to clarify and kind of repeat what you just said about contracting work is a risk because?
Oh, right. So contracting work, any form of this is called unauthorized employment options by the government. So independent contracting or an LLC as an undocumented immigrant is an unauthorized employment option. So it may have an impact on their ability to obtain legal immigration status. So if they are applying to be a citizen and yet have a record of this unauthorized employment, participating in unauthorized employment options, it could have an effect on that. However, right now, from what we've heard, it's not an egregious effect, I guess. It's nothing compared to previously either having a felony or a significant misdemeanor, but it does go back and forth with it could be a risk for them to participate in this and then not be offered legal status in the U.S. because of that.
Perfect. A couple kind of related follow-up questions to that. If someone does do independent contractor, what do they have to provide the employer? And are independent contractors required by employers to fill out and sign an I-9, or is that optional?
That's a great question. I would double check this, and all of this specific about the I-9 and the governmental forms is in the, I can go back to it, is in that bottom link for the Life After College guide for undocumented students. However, I do believe that they have to fill out an I-9 just with their social security number or that individual taxpayer identification number on it.
Awesome, thanks, Maddie. I think one more question. Somebody who has a student who has obtained a teaching certificate but is undocumented, can a school district hire or sponsor him? If so, how should he go about this process?
So again, if they have obtained DACA, then yes, a school district can, because I don't believe you have to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident for that, for teaching. If an individual does not have DACA, they can talk with that school about it being on a contract basis, or that would be to then become an independent contractor. That would be the way that I would recommend about that, is they would have to work with that school district about signing more of a contract than a full-time employment offer.
Awesome, thanks. Two more questions rolled in there. So if we want to compensate someone for their speaking opportunity, would it be okay to give them a scholarship?
So compensating a student, I'm guessing, for a speaking opportunity. Again, if they don't, yes, I think that would be fine through you. If you're a university and you're trying to hire like a current student at your university, you could talk with your financial aid department about setting aside a scholarship for that speaking opportunity, and then I don't see why that would not be allowed.
Perfect. One more question, and then she's got the second half of her presentation to do, and there will be another Q&A at the end of that as well. So this one is for undocumented students who don't have a Social Security number. What do you recommend they say when they ask for a Social Security number?
Ooh, that's a great question. That would be dependent. I think I go back and I'll talk about this a little bit later. That's dependent on each student's level of confidence in their status. Some students are more reserved about their status as an undocumented student, and some students are very proud, I guess, of that and advocate for their status. So I think having a conversation of the risks of that, of talking to a government agency about the fact that you are undocumented does have risks associated with that. However, it would be up to the student about their comfortability in that session.
Great, thanks, Maddie. There might be a few more questions, but if so, we'll make sure we get back to them at the end.
Okay, that sounds great. So now we're going to transition out of the legal jargon, but we've gone through a lot of important information. So thank you all for being awake still, and give yourselves a round of applause. I know that this can be a lot to take in, but understanding it obviously is very helpful if you are continually working with undocumented students. So now we're going to transition into discussing how you can best support these students both as employers and as career practitioners. So first, as employers, awareness is key. So if you're an employer right now and you're listening to me, then you have accomplished this by making yourself more aware. So kudos to you. As we've been talking all about DACA, I do just want to reiterate that you can hire an individual if they have DACA and a work authorization. Now, if you require U.S. citizenship or U.S. permanent residency, aka a green card, then undocumented individuals with a work authorization do not qualify. It's important to make this clear, as I'm sure most of you do, on your position descriptions and postings. Now, also remember that according to the best practices by the U.S. Department of Justice on job postings, avoid using phrases, though, such as only U.S. citizens or citizenship required, unless U.S. citizenship is required by law, regulation, executive order, or government contract. So don't just throw that phrase around. And also the difference is when it comes to paperwork of hiring an undocumented individual, the only difference is that if they have DACA is instead of providing a passport or a permanent residence card for their I-9 form, they'll provide an employment authorization document card. So this is an example of what that looks like taken from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services website. As you can see, the card was updated last May, and so you may receive either the updated employment authorization document card or the previous one there. Another aspect for employers to consider is branding. So if you want to make your organization known to this population, state clearly on your hiring websites or on specific position descriptions that you will hire individuals with DACA. Some students are very comfortable advocating for themselves, and in this case, that means applying to positions that they qualify for. And some students feel more ashamed about their status and are concerned that people, and specifically employers, will judge them based off this identity. So here's an example of how Teach for America has promoted themselves as a DACA-friendly organization. This is used in the signature of the Teach for America representative that works closely with UC Santa Barbara. Also, be sure to utilize your career services departments to make connections with specific student organizations for undocumented students. So throughout the UC system and at other universities nationally, IDEAS is a very common undocumented student or ally student organization. So that could be another way to reach out and make your organization known. Now, transitioning to more career practitioner focused side of this webinar, I'm going to revert back for a second. And so we're going to start talking about how to programmatically and emotionally support the student population. So I told you a little bit about the naivety I had coming into this role, but that's also not the whole story. After having conversations and joining the Dream Scholar resource team, I thought that I was doing my part in fulfilling my role as a documented student liaison. However, within 6 months of working at UC Santa Barbara in January of 2016, the Border Patrol came to recruit at one of our career fairs. Many undocumented students, along with allies and individuals who were against immigration law at that time, protested outside of our fair. After the career fair and after the student protest, we debriefed as career services, and I also participated in additional processing of the Dream Scholar resource team, which included listening to students who felt alienated and unsafe on campus during that time. After that processing, it was clear that there was a trust that needed to be mended with these students. So in the spring of 2016, I worked with Undocumented Student Services to host a half-day professional development retreat. This retreat started with a faculty mixer. It moved through presentations by our Office of Student Life about leadership, by myself about career development as an undocumented student, and by our Health and Wellness Department about practicing positive mental health activities. It ended with a panel of undocumented alumni talking about their journey, and we noticed that many of the questions from current students to those panelists focused on career development and post-graduation job opportunities. The presentation I developed created an additional spark to have this all in writing for undocumented students to access. So I developed the Undocumented Students Career Guide. It's 4 pages long, and it showcases how to get experience, how to disclose status to employers, and also talks about graduate school. The information is very much tailored towards undocumented students, especially talking about past experiences of fieldwork or caretaking of siblings and other family members, of what to look for in graduate school, such as ally communities and resources for undocumented students provided by that university. I've provided the link to the career guide if you'd like to take a further look at it. This Undocumented Students Career Guide is distributed to all students who attend the Dream Scholar Welcome each fall and was officially introduced the fall of 2016. Again, while I was preparing this document over the previous summer, I thought I was hitting all the marks of this liaison role. I also attended that Dream Scholar Welcome to personally let students know that I'm available at Career Services and give them a brief overview of the document. However, before I walked onto that stage, the student group that led the protest earlier that year spoke first and mentioned how they specifically protested against Career Services. That was a hard act to follow, to then be promoting Career Services to undocumented students. So again, there was a trust that needed to be built. That next year, in the spring of 2017, we decided to host a professional development series that consisted of 4 presentations, 1 per week for 4 weeks. The presentations focused on career exploration and leadership, public speaking and networking, applying for graduate school, and again, an alumni panel and luncheon. There were so many additional career topics that we weren't able to cover. So this year, we turned the 4-week series into a year-long career development program, with each quarter focusing on a different theme. Here is a breakdown of the workshops, and I'll walk you through this because I know it's a lot. So for fall 2017, we focused on career exploration. In October, students participated in a career exploration workshop where they completed the Focus 2 assessment, and we processed those results. They also had homework with each session. So their homework was to meet with a career counselor, aka me, to discuss their results and to start to develop their personal career plan. In November, representatives from our Office of Student Life held an interactive workshop on leadership. We encouraged students to get involved in student organizations on campus, and then they wrote an essay about what leadership meant to them and how they see that skill set in their lives now. For December, we discussed informational interviewing and networking, focusing on identifying who was already in their current network. They then went out and performed informational interviews and submitted an essay about their experience. This winter is focused on how to obtain experience. In January, we discussed all the different types of experiences available to them, those with DACA and without DACA. The session focused around students sharing their own stories of experiences with other students to learn from each other. Then again, they met with me to identify a specific experience that they wanted to obtain. A few weeks ago, we dived into the nitty-gritty details of resume and cover letters. Currently, their homework is to attend one of our drop-in counseling sessions to have those documents critiqued. Next week, we'll be discussing interviewing strategies and breaking down the anxiety around those interviews and addressing some specific questions related to this population. Their homework in March is to participate in a mock interview appointment at Career Services. For spring, we're focusing on life after graduation. So in April, we will identify post-graduation job search opportunities, addressing again those who have DACA and those who do not. They will again meet with me to personalize that experience. In May, we'll talk about applying to graduate school, where they will complete a graduate school evaluation worksheet to help them start to identify future programs and resources at those institutions. In June, we're going to bring everyone who's ever participated in the program together for a final group processing and evaluation session. So students apply on a quarterly basis, so they don't have to attend for the full year. And they're given funding, and with the funding from our Undocumented Student Services, they receive a $150 scholarship at the end of each quarter for attending each workshop and completing the homework activity each month. If a student stays on for all 3 quarters, they will receive $450 at the end of the year. Now, each student also participates in a pre- and post-survey measuring their confidence in different workshop areas. We have some results from our fall cohort, which was focused on career exploration, so here are some highlights. For the first chart that you see here, we had students first list out all of the career options that they thought of pursuing, then narrow those options down and rank their top 3. They then rated the statement of, I feel confident in my first choice listed above. For this statement, 6 students agreed and 6 students felt neutral, and 1 student strongly disagreed. At the end of the program, we asked those same questions. This time, 3 students strongly agreed, 6 students agreed, and 4 students felt neutral. So no students felt negatively about that statement. Another highlight is that we asked students to rank the statement, "If I had to make an occupational choice right now, I'm afraid I would make a bad choice." 6 students stated true, that they were afraid of making a bad choice, and 7 students stated false, meaning that they weren't afraid. When asked at the end of the program, 1 student stated true, that they were afraid of making a bad choice, and 12 students stated false, having a conversion of 5 students who no longer felt afraid that they would make a bad choice. And lastly, we asked students also to rate the statement, "I'm confused about deciding on a career." 10 students marked true and 3 students marked false at the beginning of the program, and at the end of the program, 7 students marked true and 6 students marked false. Through those months, we were able to increase students' confidence in making a career choice and relieve some anxiety around their career development. We also asked questions about their confidence in their leadership abilities and talking to someone that they just met about their career goals. Those results stayed relatively the same, so we will be looking at those workshops again for this coming up fall. The students also participated in a feedback survey where they answered questions about workshop content and activity engagement. And here's some feedback that we found. So one student mentioned that the career exploration meeting was the most helpful to me because not only did it provide me with a range of careers when I thought there were none meant for me, but it made me realize that I am not alone in discovering a career for me and that it's okay to not know yet. We also asked them about future improvements of the program, which included more group activities, which we incorporated this quarter into that experience strategy session where students mainly shared between each other about their own experiences. So I know that this seems like a lot of programming, and it is. It takes time to coordinate and record attendance and to check in on homework assignments. But just as we saw, the students can get a lot out of it. I'm lucky to have the financial support of our Undocumented Student Services providing scholarships, and also to Teach for America that provides funds for food so that every session has a meal provided to these students, mainly pizza and churros, mainly so that I can eat churros while doing this. So this is all great programmatically. And like I said, I have so much support here from our campus to coordinate a program like this, and it's great to see students grow through this. During fall, we had 14 participants, and this winter we have 16. As you saw, I meet with each of them to discuss their personal career goals and anxiety. And after working with undocumented students closely over the last year, I noticed a few important factors to keep in mind when working with these students. The first is safety and trust. This goes a little bit beyond what we provide for a typical college student and is so important because if you want to know you're working with an undocumented student, then it's critical for them to feel comfortable disclosing their status. It could be looking around your office or wherever you meet with students to see if there's any indication for them to see that this is a safe space. This doesn't have to mean having a sign that states undocumented students welcome in bold, but it could. It could also be an assessment just of people who walk into your office about what do they feel or think. This could also mean your presence at multicultural or undocumented students events on your campus so that you become more known to this population. It wasn't until I started creating additional programming for our students, attending events such as the opening of our new Undocumented Students Lounge, and engaging with students individually in appointments to where they started referring their friends, and I started to gain that trust back. If you're considering creating workshops or new programming, I do want to mention the somewhat anonymity that may be needed to be considered. For instance, all of the workshops that I just discussed are not on our career services calendar or website. They are listed on a completely separate calendar of events specifically for undocumented students. They can still be found, but they're only promoted to students who the event is specifically targeted for. These are just some examples of creating a space of safety and trust. Another way is to also provide empathy and authenticity. So providing a space where students can talk and you just listen. If there's not as many resources on your campus for undocumented students, providing a space where someone will just listen to their story can be instrumental. Each story is different, each student is different, and their career goals can be vastly different. If you're a Clifton Strengths buff, you can probably see my individualization strength starting to come through. As I've mentioned before, 2 years ago, I was not confident in my knowledge that I am today. So I've also sat in appointments with students where they mention a certain law or phrase that I was unaware of and had to clarify. That authenticity, I believe, adds to their trust. No one is expected to be an expert in immigration or employment law, especially after only listening to this webinar. So feel free, if you're working with a student and do not understand, to ask those clarifying questions. And please feel free to reach out to me after this webinar if you have any specific questions. Many of the conversations that I have with undocumented students either revolve around accepting their identity as an undocumented immigrant or accepting the ambiguity of their future. As I mentioned earlier, some students were not told until high school that they were undocumented and could still be processing that part of their identity, not only being a minority, but adding on another layer of being a minority. In regards to career, here are some common questions that I am asked. Many are afraid that they won't be able to work after graduating with a college degree, or will have to do it in ways that require a lot of maneuvering around laws, and these thoughts can be very overwhelming. Out of 13 students who responded to our pre-survey, 10 of them agreed with the statement that making up my mind about a career has been a problem for me because I'm uncertain of future policies and laws and how those will affect my career goals. We teach all students how to manage career change and ambiguity, but it is tenfold with this population. Undocumented students are some of the most hardworking students that I've ever known, and they often want to give back to their community and take information that I talk about to them, to their families and friends, to provide as much support as they can. They are so thankful for the support given to them, even if it's just someone taking the time to hear them. I hope that you've gained some knowledge today about working with undocumented students and have developed some ideas for how to connect with this population. Thank you, and I'd like to open it up for any additional questions at this time.
Thanks, Maddie. That was awesome and super informative, and we've already got quite a few questions.
Okay.
I saw 3 or 4 come in that were all related about how many students are undocumented at UCSB. What would you say the ratio of that number to the total enrollment at UCSB is, and how many of them actually participated in the Dream Scholar program?
Yeah, great question. So there's not really a way to fully track how many undocumented students that we have, so I can't give a specific number. The way that UC Santa Barbara looks at those numbers is by how many California Dream Act are filled out each year. So that provides them with financial aid in regards to attending university here in California. So we monitor those numbers. I believe at UC Santa Barbara, we are around 300 students. So not that many compared to our total population here. In regards to how many participated in the program, so during fall, we actually had 14 participants in the program, and then this winter we have 16. We are keeping it at around 15, mainly because of the funding for the scholarship. So we're hoping to grow that a little bit, but also not too large to keep it a small group. But as of right now, we're accepting about 15 students per quarter.
Perfect, thanks. I think all the way back to the first session, there was one more question about when undocumented students work without authorization and get caught, and then there's a pardon process and their pardon is approved, will their records still show that they were caught for working unauthorized?
Yes, and actually with that, if they're caught, so if they already, there's a few things with that I want to clarify. So if they are currently working with DACA and then have, like that DACA expires and it's actually the responsibility of the employer to manage that situation. So to check on an employee's employment authorization status and to then terminate that employee. So it does get put on their record, but as of right now, with the talks that I've heard about in regards to then moving forward with like legal status, it's not looked, like I said earlier, it's not looked as detrimentally as if someone were to commit a felony or significant misdemeanors or more misdemeanors. So if it is just them trying to provide for themselves, from what I've heard, again, this is from reading a lot of blogs and talking with immigration lawyers, that continuing to work either in an unauthorized option, or in that case, if a student has a DACA expires and they continue to work, it's mainly so that they can continue to provide for themselves, which some courts do give leniency to, versus a felony or misdemeanor.
Perfect, thanks. I'm also seeing a lot of questions about, can you repeat that URL, or can you share this or that? I would suggest copy down Maddie's email address that you see on the screen right now and probably reach out to her and ask her those questions specifically, and she'll get back to you. That's probably the easiest way. But again, this is going to be recorded and shared to everybody who registered and attended, so you'll have that as well.
Yeah, feel free to email me for any more clarifications or for those links, or if you want a copy of this presentation as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of people loved what you had to share, but some people are a little overwhelmed as well, especially smaller career service programs.
Yes.
So do you have any suggestions for schools with smaller career service offices, and additionally, any suggestions for those institutions with no DACA office or no DACA programs?
So I know it can be a little bit hard to identify who your undocumented students are, for instance, like, depending on the state that you live in. So like I said, we identify undocumented students by who submits the California Dream Act for their financial aid. But if your state does not provide that, then it can be hard to contact them. I think with this population, seeing if there is a student organization, like I said, on your campus that specifically works with this, or reaching out to multicultural organizations to let them know that your office is friendly and safe for undocumented students, could be a way to start providing some support for them. If you are a smaller institution, then you may not have a lot of undocumented students at your institution, so it may be a smaller number than like we're working with here. And so with that, you may not need to provide this like big group programming that I've provided for our students. It may just need to be letting them know that you're free and friendly and safe, and that they can trust you with disclosing their status. So it could be going out, like I said, to student orgs, or sending an email that they can send out, letting them know that you are there, you're welcome to talk with them about career development as an undocumented student if they wish to come in and share that with you.
Perfect, thanks. It looks like we have a few people typing questions into the Q&A, so I'm going to steal back the presenter just to remind everybody. But while I do that, somebody has just a general question about, Maddie, how do you stay informed about all the changes for DACA?
That's a great question. So it is, so I do it, a lot of times I have conversations with our undocumented student services coordinator, since she is more in the know than I am. I often, though, will look up, just even like for this presentation, I was Googling and trying to find substantial articles about the updates with DACA, especially with one being so recent. As of earlier this week, it was a little bit hard to find what could happen with that. I know that it can be really hard to find this information, and so I oftentimes am either we'll look at like the ACLU website, or we'll contact, like I said, our resource team. We often get updates. I also look towards our UC Office of the President for updates as well, since that's where I go through for all of what my recommendations to students should be, things like that. I know that our UC system does have a lot of support for undocumented students, and so they're keeping up more on this legal aspect of it than I am. But like I said, I get my news in a very similar fashion to most of you. I listen to an NPR podcast about Up First that tells me news updates every day, and hyper focus on immigration. But when it comes to this, I often am just searching to see what are the most recent updates. So I don't have any specific website. I just look at news sources, and oftentimes, especially when it comes to what the specific, like whether or not to submit and things like that, I mainly look at the U.S. citizenship website, because that's really the final say, not necessarily like if the New York Times said, oh yeah, you can submit. I mean, it has to go through the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services website. And so that if you look on there for DACA, they often keep that updated. and I believe last week or recently released an article about, again, kind of what their procedure is because of those federal court orders.
Thanks, Maddie. We've got a bunch more questions now. We'll try and get to as many of these as we can in the next 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
The next question is, what is your advice for non-DACA students who need to work on campus? How does that student work and get paid?
Yeah, great question. So we actually have that here at UC Santa Barbara. We have a few departments, and that is through more of this contract position, but it's an internship scholarship that's through our financial aid department. So instead of going through payroll and you need to contact your human resources about how all of this works, but instead of going through payroll as being paid on a weekly or biweekly or monthly basis, a student is given a scholarship for their work. So similar to how some students get research scholarships, it's also an internship scholarship. So we have a few student affairs departments that do some of their work that way. That contract, however, I've been told, does look different than a typical hourly wage employee. So there are some stipulations about what tasks that student can do, what's a little bit different about it. But contacting, that would be working with your financial aid department and human resources department about that. Currently, we're actually trying to set up a model to talk with departments about how to make that transition, because we know that even though DACA right now, you know, you can ask for, people can resubmit and can renew their DACA. We're going to start seeing students who never have been able to get DACA, and so they cannot renew since they never had it. And how does that work? How do they get experience on campus? So at UC Santa Barbara, we're actually meeting with our undocumented student services, with our financial aid department, to start talking about how to change some of our payroll positions into scholarship positions. So that is a way to do that. You would just have to check with your financial aid and human resources department on how that works, because I'm not sure.
Thanks, Maddie. Here's another question. What kind of funding source can the university use to pay for stipends and scholarships?
Ooh, so that's a great question too. I believe at UC Santa Barbara, we've had a Dream Scholar Fund. With everything going on over the last few years, they have developed specifically a Dream Scholar Fund that individuals can donate to. We have gotten funding from our office, from the UC Office of the President. I believe that's where all of that funding has come from. So it would be talking with the higher ups in your institution about how to start getting funding for that. All of the funding side of things I don't really work on. I'm starting to dive more and more into that now, with working with financial aid and working with our human resources department, but I actually haven't had any experience of how to obtain that funding. Our undocumented student services department usually obtains that funding, and then I just get to now use it for career development somewhat, which is nice.
So here's a question from the flip side of this. So what feedback have you heard from employers regarding undocumented applicants?
So typically, I haven't heard a lot from employers, because a lot of our students actually haven't worked out. I've only been working with this population for about 2 years, and really in-depthly for about 1 year now. And so I haven't had any students that I've come in contact with that I've actually worked outside the university, and so I've worked with an employer, because I think that they are afraid of that stigma. We are going to talk about next quarter, when we talk about post-graduation job search, and that can also be internship search for students with DACA, about when to have those conversations to disclose their status. Employers, you may have undocumented students who have DACA and work authorization, and you just don't know it because they've never had to have that conversation with you, because they don't need to. So it could just be that sense of being unaware, and it's up to that student on whether or not they feel comfortable with their identity in that to disclose. The only time that they really have to disclose is when filling out that I-9 form, and even then an employment authorization document card can come from multiple areas, from multiple people, not just undocumented immigrants, and so that could be their kind of way of disclosing. But if you personally are not with them filling out that information as a supervisor or as a recruiter, I guess that would be the only time that you would actually know, unless they disclose to you. And if that is true, like I said, and if they do decide to disclose to you, obviously you have to take out your personal respond to that about kind of how you feel about this population, but at the same time, with supporting these students who are here, who have DACA, who are able to work, they're just trying to gain experience so that they can get a job after graduation and be able to support themselves, and most of the time also be able to support their family and to give back to their family.
Thanks, Maddie. We've got a few more minutes and a few more questions, but if you have any others, type them into the chat window now. So here's another question. How did you rebuild trust with your faculty and staff after the protests at your fair? For example, how did you rebuild trust in order to host and promote programming again?
Yeah, that's a great question. So honestly, it was by me showing up and having personal one-on-one conversations with students. I was there for the processing. I got to hear the stories of how students felt unsafe on campus during that time. And I honestly, after that meeting, walked up to each student who shared their story and told them that I support them, and that there were other considerations around that protest that Career Services needed, that Career Services was taking into consideration, but that as a career counselor, I was supporting their career development. That is my job at UCSB, is to support all students' career success. And so I went up and just told each and every one of them. I also then had a conversation with our Undocumented Student Services coordinator about how to start rebuilding this trust. And so when I was doing that, it wasn't a big promotion of, hey, I'm now the new Undocumented Student career counselor. It was more one-on-one with these students. So I started showing up at events with them. I started to get to know them personally, one-on-one, which then, or as a small group, which then rippled out a little bit more. So I think it was honestly through that, through people saying, I mean, they could have said like, oh, Career Services, but a friend had a session with me that went really well, where we were able to personally talk about their career development as an undocumented student, and it was safe, and they trusted me. So then it oftentimes turned into friends trusting me, or they came to an event and saw how open I was and how it wasn't just for show. I do really care about these students and feel like they're the most hardworking students on this campus. So in building that trust, it was a slow process. Luckily, I had the support from our Undocumented Student Services coordinator, who also promoted that and who I get referrals from for students. But it took a little while. It probably took about a year to rebuild that.
Thanks, Maddie. There's a few curious people who want to know, did Border Patrol continue to come to your future career fairs, and are they still recruiting there?
They have not. So they were coming in and recruiting at a lot of UCs during that time, and there were many UCs also had a similar situation where protests occurred during their fair, and they have not come back to recruit here.
Thanks, Maddie. Well, I think that is it. If we missed any questions, again, feel free to reach out directly to Maddie. But that's it for today. Thank you all for your time today, and a big thank you to Maddie and MPACE for hosting this. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar to everyone who attended today within the next week or so. And don't forget to sign up for our last Regional ACE webinar in 2018. It should be coming up in a couple months here. And also don't forget to stop by at NACE this summer and say hi to GradLeaders, and at all the Regional ACE conferences coming this fall. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.